Karen right there. So I've been working with Angular for the past 2 years, and using it for everything at work. How many people here, just show of hands, use Angular today? Okay, most people. So how many people like using Angular? Okay. So some people giving like a maybe. How many people know someone who maybe doesn't like Angular as much, maybe even hates Angular? A fair number of people, right? So there are good reasons why most people in this room like Angular, and there are also good reasons why a lot of the people that you may know of may not like it as much. What we're going to go over in this talk are some of the common criticisms that people have of Angular, and talk about what of that is myth versus reality. So it's not hard to find criticisms of Angular. If you pay attention to Hacker News, especially or Reddit, which is even worse, or look online for Angular versus anything, you'll find all sorts of articles talking about things that aren't as good. But the interesting thing is, after I've done a lot of research in kind of preparation for this talk, I have sort of become an expert on anti-Angular rants. And you can sort of boil down almost every one of these articles and the people who kind of talk about this stuff to 5 primary areas of criticism: performance, learning curve, ability to reason, rendering, and migration. So I'm going to go through each of these and kind of talk about what is it that people are actually talking about, what is actually a problem versus not really that big of an issue. So let's start with performance. And the thing you'll hear a lot is Angular is slow, right? And what does that mean? Let's look at a simple example where you have HTML with Angular markup and nested ng repeat. So you have 2 ng repeats, and then the bindings in the middle part here are a function, get title, and then just another binding. So for the sake of argument, for the sake of this discussion, let's just say that this takes 1 millisecond. That is actually a long time for a function to take, but it'll help with some of the calculations here. So let's just say it takes 1 second. And let's say there's 100 users, which is a fairly sizable list, but not humongous. I think that's reasonable that we might have something like that in our web apps. And let's say for skills, there's like 10 skills, right? So how long do you think that this will take to render initially? What's that?
100 milliseconds.
Well, close. But if you do 1 times 100 times 10, that's 1,000, which is 1 second, right? So it would make sense, actually, if it was 1 second. What it is in reality is 3 seconds. And the reason is because the way that Angular, the digest cycle, has to work with, in order to accommodate two-way binding and a couple other things internally, is that it will run the digest cycle multiple times. And so it's not just that one pass through, it'll actually do it a couple times, right? Now, subsequent calls, it actually, they've made a lot of improvements over the years within Angular core to optimize stuff. Before it would always be 3 seconds every single run of the digest cycle. So the subsequent digest cycles are a little bit better, 1 second. The reason for this is that when you have a function, the Angular core doesn't know how to optimize that, so it just has to call it every time. It doesn't know whether something's changed or not. Whereas if it was just a primitive value, it would. Now, there's plenty of optimizations you can make to this code, but the point is that when you don't understand how the Angular internals work, it's very easy to run into performance issues when you're dealing with long lists and that type of thing. And really what we're talking about is that performance within Angular is sort of a linear function when you look at it on a graph. The more stuff you're kind of adding to the page, the slower it can get. Now, on the lower end of this, just should be noted that there is a sort of line there of how much you can actually visually, your human perception can notice. So that at the lower end, when you're building simple apps and stuff like that, you don't even notice any sort of issue. It's only when you start to have these kind of bigger pages, longer lists, and that type of thing where it gets to be a problem. And it should be noted that over the various versions of Angular, 1.2, 1.3 especially, they have made optimizations within Angular to make this a little bit flatter of a linear progression. But really what we're talking about, the factors that go into this is the number of expressions and then the time to evaluate each expression. So when we're talking about optimizations, if you run into these types of problems, the way that you make your Angular 1 app faster is by either lowering the number of expressions that have to be evaluated with each digest cycle, or optimizing the time it takes to evaluate each expression, right? Now, they've been able to do certain things internally in order to do this stuff by caching certain expressions and that type of thing. But you in your application code, and people who have used Angular a lot, have more complex apps, understand this sort of intuitive. They know that for a number of expressions, for example, you use one-time binding when you don't need to have it kind of evaluate with every turn of the digest cycle. And there's other ways of kind of making it so that it doesn't have to be evaluated every digest cycle. And for time to evaluate each expression, the typical rule of thumb is that you don't use a function for the most part within your expressions, because generally that's slow. And if you can, pre-compute the value. So instead of having a complex expression you're binding to, you sort of pre-compute it within the controller, and then it just binds to a simple value. And that is very fast, right? So you can sort of get around these by following sort of best practices. Fortunately, with Angular 2, the story gets even a lot better. So they've just, the red line there is the standard for using plain JavaScript objects, that they just figure out ways to make that faster in general. But they also have the ability with Angular 2 to use different types of objects, like mutable objects or observables. And when you do that, it becomes almost a constant function, because you're lowering the number of items that have to be evaluated to something that's just a small number. Like when you use immutable data, it's a very small number of things that have to be reevaluated with each digest cycle. So Angular 2 is going to be a lot faster and not have, you might still run into some of these issues, but you'll have many, many more tools to deal with the problems when you do run into them. I strongly suggest, if you guys haven't seen on YouTube from ngconf, Dave Smith gave a great talk, Angular plus React equals speed. I would definitely recommend this. He sort of showcases how using some of the stuff I just mentioned with Angular 2, it makes it just as fast as React is, I mean, it always depends on the situation or whatever, but strongly recommend watching it. So it's not really fair, I don't think, to just say a blanket statement, Angular is slow. I think it's more accurate to probably say an app built with Angular 1 can be slow if you have an inefficient expression in a long list. All right, learning curve. So something that a lot of people complain about, Angular hard to learn, and this is not really true at first, right? At first, when we're using just kind of the magic two-way data binding and showing a prototype to-do app or whatever, Angular is actually really simple. There's tons of examples out there where you can play with Angular or Plunker or whatever, and it just seems magical. It's like you pull all this stuff up, and you're like, wow, it's amazing that it's able to do all this stuff. But then you try to build a custom directive, right? And then it's like, well, how does this work? Like, what's a priority? Like, how does terminal work? Like, there's just a lot of moving parts here where it can get complex quick, and you end up having to understand how Angular works under the scenes in order to code some of your more advanced functionality. And this definitely exists. Like, that's it's a valid statement to talk about a learning curve for some of the more advanced stuff within Angular, for sure. I would agree. The one offsetting factor, I would say, though, is that the community within Angular is great about this. There's a ton of resources out there, like Egghead, which has great videos. There's all the people within the Angular community, either on Gitter. If you guys don't use Gitter, definitely, I would suggest using that. It's like an IRC type of, like an IRC for the modern world. And that's where kind of all the Angular devs are kind of hanging out there more so than IRC now. And the community loves to help. Like there's a sort of culture of helping each other. If you guys haven't felt that, which hopefully you feel that actually in this meetup as well. But if you ask anyone, Sharon, myself, to help out, we love to help other Angular devs and help you with your development. And the Angular core team itself, if any of you guys have tried to reach out to them, they are always open and always respond to feedback, which is great. Also, there are a number of resources out there. These are the two best ones. So I was going to put all sorts of links up there, but to be quite honest, every single link I could think of for information are in these two places. So the first one from J.M. Cunningham is for Angular 1 resources, and then the second one is for Angular 2 resources. Now, if you do start to look into Angular 2, which is definitely going to be one of the major recommendations for this talk in general, just realize that right now it's still an alpha. So if you try to like learn Angular right now, which I would encourage, but it sort of feels like this. You're like drinking from the fire hose there, and it definitely can get crazy. But there's a lot of reasons to believe that the people that are looking at it right now can definitely see that it's going to make Angular 2 is going to be much easier to learn than Angular 1 once it's fully baked. And the reason for that, there's three reasons for that. One of them is the simplified concepts. So if you guys hadn't seen the keynote from NGConf, I would strongly recommend that as well. But what Igor and Brad talk about there is that a lot of the concepts within Angular 2 eliminate the need for cruft that exists within Angular 1. So just as an example, the way that one of the bindings work that you bind to a property of an element, it eliminates the need for like 16 different directives within Angular 1. And the event binding eliminates like another 20 directives. So there's like much less overhead of things that you have to learn because they've created these much simpler concepts that align with web components. Then better tooling. If you do start to look at the Angular 2 building apps in Angular 2, you'll see that it's much more explicit than Angular 1. You have to explicitly define your dependencies and that type of thing. And at first, to be quite honest, I thought it was like a little bit too much cruft, that type of thing. And I think that they are going to have some stuff to improve that part of things. But the major benefit is that it catches your errors, catches typos very quickly, that your app will error out right away if you're missing something, like in your, let's say, your template, right? Right now, if you try to use a directive, let's say, in your template, and you didn't include it in your app definition, a lot of times it just will like not work, and you're like, what just happened? You don't even know. Or you'll see some error that in Angular 1, you'll click on a link and it'll bring you to a web page, and sometimes like that web page has a like link to another web page, which is like some sort of recursive weird thing where I'm like, okay, just tell me what is wrong. But no, so in Angular 2, a lot of that's going to be different. That the tooling itself, like WebStorm or whatever you're using, is going to be able to like add your typing, not only do like much better autocomplete, but just tell you right then what the problem is, because everything is explicit, and if you aren't defining it within the annotations, it'll tell you right away. And then the standards focus. When you look at a lot of the Angular 2 code, you'll notice that it is mostly ES6. All the Angular specific stuff has been segmented off to annotations. So you have just plain old JavaScript, really, that you're coding in. There's no like crazy wrappers. There's not any that type of thing that make it incompatible with server-side JavaScript and that type of thing. So you can do isomorphic much easier. You can mix and match. Like a service, for example, you don't have to create like an Angular.service. You just create a function, and then you just share it through an ES6 module, and that's it.
Question, for someone like me who doesn't really know Angular 1 and has no like compelling reason to know it right now, is there an advantage to just like hang in there a little while and just learn Angular 2? Or should I jump in and like learn Angular 1 and then unlearn stuff when I get to Angular 2?
That's a good question. So I do have an answer to that in the migration part of things that I talk about some of that. And if that doesn't answer your question, let's definitely talk about that. So again, I think it's a little bit harsh to just say blatantly that Angular is hard to learn. It's more that some things in Angular 1 can be hard to learn, but there are many resources available, and things are going to get a lot easier with Angular 2 eventually. All right, third thing, ability to reason. Now, some of you may wonder, okay, what's the difference between learning and reasoning? Like, are they the same thing? So learning is like when you're trying to figure out how something works. Like you don't know how this works, and you're just trying to learn it for the first time. Reasoning is that you kind of know how it works, but you've built something in this case, Angular. You have your Angular app, and you want to understand how your own app that you built, how it's running, what it's doing. And that can be hard sometimes. I know that I felt at times with my Angular app, it's a little bit like the Large Hadron Collider. Do you guys know what the Large Hadron Collider is? Some nodding heads. So in France and Switzerland, they have this 5-mile long huge tube where they're launching electrons around the speed of light and smashing them into each other to try to find black holes. And so this sort of analogy here for Angular is that sometimes when I'm running my Angular app, we can do some awesome things, for sure, but then something goes wrong, or even sometimes when something goes right, I'm sort of left scratching my head and wondering, don't really know how that happened, but I do have some theories, but they might require several extra dimensions of reality to explain. But the reason why people say this as a criticism, and sometimes I personally have run into this, there could be multiple explanations, but I think most of the time what it comes down to is with the way that data binding works and updates within Angular. So that if you have one area of your code with two-way data binding, an ng model of a variable, and this is kind of a simple example to illustrate, but larger apps have different variations of what I'm about to describe. So you might have two-way data binding in one place, and then somewhere else in your code, you have a service that's updating that same value. So you'll see here that blah is being updated by two different places, right? And because you can bind your data all over the place, with larger apps, especially if you're, because, for performance reasons, like I mentioned earlier, you have to do a calculated primitive value so that it's performing, right? But when you do that, then you have to make sure that when one thing is updated, the other thing is updated. Whenever you have that type of situation, it can get really complex to keep everything in sync. In this particular case, what happens if I'm typing in this text box and then the service updates blah? They're both bound to the same value, right? So what's going to happen? The stuff I'm typing is going to get kind of blown away. There's a lot of different variations of this where the data and the way that it's bound within Angular can get confusing. So the way that you combat this is through style. Specifically, there's a couple things. So the first thing is style with using style guides as an example. I would say just following best practices is a more general thing, but the style guides that Todd Lotto and John Papa put together, which are similar but slightly different, are at least one starting point. If you don't have your own kind of best practices guide, these two are a good place to start. So I would definitely recommend checking those out. The other thing is checking out, Matthias put together a really good blog post, and I think there's also a video cast on AirPair for component-based Angular directives. So what he's talking about there is essentially building in your Angular 1 app using a component-driven mentality. So you use directives as components, which means essentially that you don't use ng controller, you don't use ng model anywhere, you don't use scope, and you instead treat directives as components. You use the controller as syntax and data stores, which means just a centralized place where you're updating your data. So I don't have time to kind of go into each of these details here, but I strongly recommend checking out Matthias's course, and he kind of gets into a lot more detail. And I mean, with a lot of this stuff, by the way, I'm more than willing to kind of talk afterwards in the back in more detail as well. All right, so Angular 2, like the other stuff I talked about, the story gets a lot better. Angular ability to reason is one of the areas where Angular 2 really, really shines. And the reason is because whereas everything in Angular 1, the sort of dependency graph is like all over the place, they've built both data and the component model in Angular 2 to be a tree, to be very logical in structure. So in order to see how data flows through the system, it's very easy. You just start off at the root and you kind of drill your way down. There's no like kind of cross dependencies as much as there can be in Angular 1. And there is a great talk on this, also from ngconf, change detection reinvented from Victor Salkin. Strongly recommend that to kind of get into the details of this. All right, so Angular hard to reason. Let's say large apps built with Angular 1 can be hard to reason if you don't use component-driven design and don't follow best practices. All right, render. So Angular cannot render outside the browser, meaning no server rendering, no mobile rendering, no canvas rendering, and that's just sad. Of course, a couple months ago, I gave a talk about isomorphic Angular, talking about some stuff that I've been doing at work to get server rendering working on Angular. But like I talked about at NG, I gave this talk at ngconf as well. And like I mentioned there, essentially what I built was a big hack, really, because Angular core doesn't have, it's tightly coupled. It is tightly coupled to the DOM. Like that first criticism is right from that standpoint. There is really no effective way to get Angular working server-side, working isomorphically. And what I built was sort of a hack by building this external engine that just kind of mimics it, right? But during that talk, I talked about the fact that what I was psyched for is working within Angular 2 to actually build that within the framework, to make it something that's actually part of core. And so during ngconf, I hooked up with this guy, Patrick JS, if you guys have seen him online. Very smart developer, also very interested in server rendering and a lot of the same stuff that I've kind of been working on. And so we started working on it, made some progress, and eventually Brad Green hooked us up with Tobias from the core team. If you guys don't know Tobias, oh, actually no, that's not it. Yeah, I confused the two. So this is Tobias on the right-hand side here. It looks very similar. But Tobias is a really smart Angular developer on the core team. He basically was the primary person responsible for the rendering architecture within Angular 2. And so that works somewhat similar to React without the DOM diffing. Basically, in Angular 2, they have an application layer, which is everything that kind of you're working on when you're building an app, right? Everything you have for your components and your templates and all that type of stuff. But when you actually render, when you actually push something out to show on the screen, there's a completely separated layer that can be easily switched out. So whereas Angular 1 is tightly coupled to the DOM, in Angular 2, it's actually very simple to switch out that rendering layer for something else. Now, they don't, right today, have the server rendering and the native rendering like React Native and all that, but there's different groups that are working on that. So Patrick and I are on the team that's actually working on the server rendering. There's a different team that's working to use that rendering layer to build something similar to React Native. There's also a team similarly that's working on for getting Angular working web workers. So you can see that it's a lot of like really cool stuff that's coming down as far as the rendering goes in Angular 2. So for sure, with this statement, you have to restrict it to Angular 1. Can't render the browser without crazy hacks. But with Angular 2, it has the potential to render anywhere. So eventually, there is going to be a lot of that stuff that we're talking about. All right. It's a big one. Migration. There is no migration path to tomorrow. This is the thing that like people are like totally freaking out about, going crazy, just like getting super pissed at everyone that they have to throw away their code, just totally restart, right? So how true is this? So let's just all calm down. Serenity now, serenity now. And just realize this one slide from NGConf was, they didn't focus on it that much, but this was really, really important in my mind. Basically what this is depicting is that within Google, from the time that they've announced Angular 2 back in October 2014 to back in March, Angular usage has only increased within Google. And that's on 1x. I mean, so, the common question that I think I even heard in the beginning of this talk was somebody asks, like, okay, should I be building something now in Angular, if it's way, or whatever else? I mean, you can see from the people that know best, right, that are closest to the team, they're continuing forging ahead, building tons of apps on Angular 1. And, by the way, there's a question mark there, but I was talking to Brad earlier today, and he said they're actually giving an update to Angular U, which is in a couple months, but that chart has gotten even much higher since then. So the reason, I believe, after kind of really getting into Angular 2, why within Google they just aren't concerned about this at all and they continue to forge ahead, is because you have the ability right now today, everyone in this room, to build an Angular 2 app in Angular 1. Not with the 2 engine and that type of thing, but I'm talking about the concepts. So one part of it I already mentioned, for building a component-driven system. So like that course that I mentioned from Matthias, the reason why he put that out is because a lot of the stuff he talks about there aligns your Angular 1 app with Angular 2. Also, there are a number of components that will actually translate from 1 to 2. So like the component router, which Brian is about to talk about in like 10 minutes here, is going to be the same component router is going to be used in Angular 1 and Angular 2. That's Matthias's little icon there for ng-animate. So ng-animate isn't yet working in Angular 2, but the code base that he's working on is going to be the same exact thing. We're going to be working in both. If you use ES6 or TypeScript, you can jump on those today and still have a functional, in both worlds. And there's going to be more. Like, so there's already a lot of discussion in Gitter, and other forums with Angular devs about a whole bunch of other stuff that they're going to be doing over the course of the next couple months to bridge the gap. Like, you're trying to build decorators, that you can use in Angular 1, and other things like that. So basically, if you look at this in from this standpoint, the step 1 is alignment. That on the left side, you have your kind of crazy Angular 1 app. Like, I think I took this from like one of Gleb's apps that it looks like. And then you make it more sane. You put it into the Angular 2 concepts and mentality for a component-driven system. That's what's depicted there. Each of those A, B, C is a component, in a tree hierarchy. And once you have it aligned, then it's much easier to translate from 1 to 2. Like, really, then it's just a syntax exercise for the most part, if you do a good job of kind of aligning it. So even today, you can start building for Angular 2. You don't have to wait at all. So I don't think that it's valid to say this at all. I think there is a migration path, and it's only going to get better over time. Thanks a lot. What time do we have? Okay, we got to switch to Brian. So we'll have a couple minute break.